It wasn't a battlefield in the normal sense. It was a place where the jungle didn't just hide enemies. It erased entire units. Men didn't always die from bullets in the Pacific War between 1942 and 1945. Many never even saw the enemy who killed them. And the strangest part, some of the most effective survival tactics were never written in official manuals, because they were born out of pure desperation. Before we go deeper, understand this. Some of these tactics were so extreme that modern soldiers still study them in silence. And if you think war is just strategy, wait until you hear what number 3 did with nothing but vines and mud, or how number 5 turned disease itself into a survival shield. Stay till the end, because what happened in the Pacific wasn't just war. It was extinction, delayed only by human instinct. This is not strategy. This is survival. The Pacific Theater, 1942. U.S. forces landed on islands that looked alive, but acted like traps. Heat so heavy it pressed down on the lungs. Jungle so dense that daylight barely touched the ground. And silence, the kind that feels watched. One of the first forgotten survival tactics was something soldiers called silent terrain reading. Instead of relying on maps, which were often useless or outdated, soldiers learned to read the jungle itself. Broken branches weren't just obstacles. They were messages. Fresh mud meant movement. Disturbed leaves meant passage. Even insects became indicators. If insects avoided a patch of ground, soldiers assumed danger, enemy presence, or worse, disease zones. It wasn't strategy. It was listening to nature like it was intelligence. And it worked. More patrols survived simply because they stopped treating the jungle as scenery and started treating it like an enemy that speaks. Then came something even more brutal. Water discipline survival rule. In the Pacific heat, thirst was not discomfort, it was hallucination. Soldiers quickly learned that drinking too much water too fast could be as deadly as drinking none at all. So they developed strict ration pacing, small sips, timed intervals, and most importantly, never drinking after panic exertion. Entire units survived long marches not because they had more water, but because they controlled their desperation. And here's the part no one talks about. Many collapses in the jungle were not from enemy fire. They were from overhydration after panic. That single correction saved thousands of lives. Now we reach something darker. Malaria zones were everywhere. Instead of waiting for medicine that wasn't always available, soldiers adapted a strange survival habit. They moved at dusk and rested during peak mosquito hours, but not fully. Guards stayed half awake, rotating constantly, burning small controlled smoke fires using damp leaves. The smoke wasn't just for visibility. It was protection. Mosquitoes avoided it. But it also revealed something else. Smoke became a signal marker for friendly units across terrain. A survival method became accidental communication. And then there is the one tactic that feels almost unbelievable. Equipment abandonment prioritization. When movement meant survival, soldiers had to decide what to drop. But it wasn't random. They followed a brutal mental rule. If it doesn't increase survival in the next 6 hours, it gets left behind. Weapons were kept. Food was kept. But comfort items, extra gear, even sometimes spare ammunition, were sacrificed for speed. It created a mindset shift. Survival was no longer about having more. It was about carrying less than the enemy expected you to survive with. Here's where things start to shift. Because once these tactics became routine, soldiers stopped thinking like traditional armies and started thinking like something else entirely. Adaptation machines. By this point in the Pacific War, something had changed in the way survival worked. It was no longer about reacting to danger. It was about becoming part of the environment, so the environment stopped exposing you. And this is where one of the most important forgotten survival tactics emerged. Jungle camouflage discipline. Not just wearing camouflage. Becoming invisible in behavior. Soldiers learned something simple but deadly. Movement is louder than sound. Even a perfectly hidden soldier could give himself away by how he moved through leaves, how he broke branches, how he stepped on dry ground. So they trained themselves to move like water. Slow. Unpredictable. No straight lines. And most importantly, never rushing, even under pressure. Because rushing in the jungle meant leaving a signature behind. Then came a psychological survival shift. Enemy assumption bias. Instead of assuming the enemy was everywhere, soldiers started assuming the enemy was already watching. This changed everything. Resting positions were no longer chosen for comfort. They were chosen for invisibility. A good hiding spot wasn't where you could see the enemy. It was where the enemy would never think to look twice. That mental shift alone prevented countless ambushes. But survival wasn't just about hiding. It was also about listening. And one of the most underrated tactics was something called sound mapping. Soldiers learned to decode the jungle through sound layers. Birds suddenly stopping, possible movement, monkeys becoming loud and chaotic, predator or human disturbance. Even rainfall patterns changed when large groups moved beneath canopy cover. They didn't just hear sounds. They interpreted patterns. The jungle became a warning system. Now here's where things become brutal again. Food shortages were constant. So soldiers developed a survival method that sounds almost impossible. Calorie conservation movement. They learned to calculate movement cost versus energy return. Every unnecessary step was avoided. They stopped walking in straight patrol lines and started using terrain shortcuts that reduced energy loss, even if it increased risk slightly. Because in long jungle campaigns, exhaustion killed faster than bullets. And then, something very important happened. They stopped seeing survival as individual, and started seeing it as collective balance. If one soldier collapsed from exhaustion, it risked the entire unit. So they developed silent support systems. Sharing load without speaking. Adjusting pace without orders. Rotating front positions without command. It became a silent coordination system. No shouting. No visible signals. Just understanding. But not all adaptations were physical. Some were deeply psychological. One of the most powerful forgotten tactics was called fear normalization. At first, soldiers were overwhelmed by constant threat, ambushes, disease, unknown terrain. But over time, they trained their minds to treat fear as background noise. Not eliminating it, but normalizing it until it stopped controlling decisions. This mental shift was often the difference between panic and survival. And as the war progressed deeper into jungle territories, something else began to appear. A strange realization among surviving units. The jungle was not the enemy. The enemy was anything that disrupted balance inside the jungle. That mindset would shape everything that came next. By this stage of the Pacific War, survival stopped being reactive. It became predictive. Soldiers were no longer just avoiding danger. They were anticipating it before it formed. And that's where one of the most critical forgotten tactics appeared. Pre-contact positioning. Before any known enemy encounter, units would stop thinking in terms of where they were, and start thinking in terms of where contact was most likely to happen. They would reposition not to defend a location, but to avoid becoming predictable targets. It sounds simple, but in dense jungle terrain, this reduced ambush losses dramatically, because predictability, not strength, was what got units wiped out. Then came a darker adaptation. Silence weaponization. Silence in the jungle was never natural. It was always information. So soldiers learned to use silence itself as a tactical tool. Entire patrols would pause movement simultaneously, creating false environmental patterns. Enemy scouts listening from distance would interpret silence incorrectly, assuming either retreat or absence. Then, movement would resume in a different direction entirely. Confusion became protection. But survival still demanded more than deception. It demanded endurance control. This led to a tactic known as pain compartmentalization. Soldiers trained themselves to mentally separate pain from action. Injuries were acknowledged, but not allowed to control movement decisions. A wounded leg didn't mean stop. It meant adjust, shift weight, reduce speed, change terrain, but never halt unless absolutely necessary. Because in the jungle, stopping meant being absorbed by it. Here's where things shift again. Disease was not just a threat. It was a constant presence. And instead of only avoiding it, soldiers adapted another survival logic. Exposure rotation. Units rotated exposure zones, areas with high mosquito density, contaminated water risk, or infected terrain. Instead of trying to eliminate risk completely, they distributed it. This reduced mass infection events that could wipe out entire squads at once. And then came one of the most surprising adaptations: resource illusion tactics. When moving through contested zones, soldiers would sometimes leave controlled traces, fake footprints, abandoned rations, or disturbed foliage patterns, not to attract attention, but to misdirect enemy tracking logic. The goal was simple: make the enemy follow the wrong story. And it worked more often than expected. But perhaps the most important survival shift wasn't physical at all. It was identity. Soldiers stopped thinking of themselves as traditional military units. They started thinking like adaptive organisms inside a hostile ecosystem. Not conquerors, not invaders, but temporary survivors inside an environment that could erase them without warning. And this is where everything begins to converge. Because these tactics were no longer separate tricks. They became a unified system of survival intelligence. Movement, silence, fear, terrain, and even exhaustion all became part of a single operating logic. By the final stages of the Pacific War, something irreversible had happened. Survival was no longer a set of tactics. It had become a mindset that reshaped how soldiers perceived reality itself. And many of the methods they used didn't disappear when the war ended. They evolved. One of the most lasting legacies was what later military thinkers called adaptive minimal presence. The idea was simple: the less you gave the environment to notice you, the more likely you were to survive inside it. Modern special operations training still reflects this principle. Small footprints, limited noise, controlled visibility, not to dominate space, but to pass through it without resistance. Then there was another evolution: predictive survival thinking. Instead of reacting to threats, soldiers began training themselves to anticipate conditions before they fully developed. Weather shifts, terrain changes, fatigue buildup, enemy movement patterns. Everything became part of a mental forecasting system. This wasn't luck. It was disciplined awareness. And it is still studied in modern survival training programs. But perhaps the most important takeaway wasn't tactical. It was psychological. The Pacific War taught one brutal truth: survival is not about strength. It is about adaptation under pressure. Those who tried to hold rigid thinking often didn't last long. Those who adapted continuously often survived conditions that should have been impossible. And here is something most people never realize. Many of these so-called forgotten tactics were never truly forgotten. They were absorbed quietly into modern military doctrine. Repackaged, refined, sanitized. But the core ideas remain the same. Move less, observe more, react smarter, survive longer. Now think about this. Every tactic you heard in this video wasn't just history. It was a response to extreme conditions where mistakes were not corrected. They were punished immediately. And that is why these stories still matter today. Because they show something deeper than war. They show how humans evolve when survival is the only rule left. If this shocked you, then answer this in the comments. Which survival tactic do you think would work in today's world? And if you want more forgotten war stories like this, you already know what to do.